Hi, I'm Taylor Owen. On this episode of Machines Like Us, I'm speaking with Jim Balsillie. Jim is one of Canada's best-known tech entrepreneurs and has built one of the most successful tech companies in the world, RIM. He's also been an incredibly vocal participant in the debate about Canadian economic policy and about Canadian sovereignty. And these two things, building an immensely successful Canadian tech company and being a strident proponent of Canadian sovereignty, make him the perfect person to talk about the moment we're now in. In this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the history of Canadian economic policy, about the state of the Canadian tech sector, and perhaps most importantly, what we should be watching for in our next Prime Minister to get a sign that they've learned the lessons of the past and are building a sovereign Canada. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be with you, Taylor.
So 25 years ago, you built one of the biggest, most important tech companies in the world. And you did it from Canada, and you did it in Waterloo, where we are right now. If you're starting it now, would you do the same?
Well, it's harder. It's harder for a couple of reasons. Back then, it was really beautiful because we had politicians that would do things like Team Canada, where you would go around the world and say, buy my products. And they understood that it's the purchase order. And a lot of that credit would go to Jean Chrétien, but Paul Martin did it some too, and a bit with Stephen Harper.
So promoting Canadian companies to the world, on the world stage.
Buy my product.
Okay.
Because that's, if you have a high margin product you sell to the world, that enhances your terms of trade.
And the devices you were selling were those high
100%,
margin
that
products.
Drives up your productivity.
Okay.
Governments were very, very pro-Canadian. And that was really beautiful.
So I want to get into a bunch of things that have changed, but just say a little bit more about what that moment was like, because it does feel, looking back at it now, like this was a moment of optimism, of kind of alignment, like you said, between the interests of the country and the interests of your company and the emerging tech sector in Canada. And is that right? Is that what it felt like?
Yeah. Well, we started an organization to speak for Canadian companies because at that time, the largest employers in Waterloo region were and the largest hirers, I should say, of Waterloo grads were Microsoft and IBM and NCR and Hewlett Packard. So the key was go work for an American firm, leave. And we took an attitude of let's build our companies here.
And keep the people here too.
Let's keep the people here. Yeah. Let's have the wealth effects. Let's have the management rollover, spillover ecosystems. That was really the focus back then. And the politicians were very much oriented to grow the companies. And we just had tremendous support from, quite frankly, provincial and federal to say, buy these products, take it to the world. It was beautiful. And it's such a contrast to now, where the political narrative is come and take our people, come and buy our startups cheap, come and take our ideas for free. And I've never heard in the last 10 years, the Prime Minister say, buy our products. And so what happens is when you're helping foreign countries sell their products into Canada by setting up their branch plants here, then naturally your GDP per capita goes down because you're not pushing high value added products to the world. So paychecks get worse.
So I want to get into that. But so let's talk about what changed then, right? So late 90s, you do have sort of an alignment between this sector and policy objectives from the government. And then in the early 2000s, for that next decade, what do we see in this space? The emergence of big American tech companies, and something changes according to your view of this, right? So what happens in that decade? And what went wrong in that decade?
Well, I think the most important thing that went wrong in Canada was we never updated our thinking. As the world in the early mid-90s was moving to a knowledge-based economy, Canada's economic thinking was a production-based economy. So we didn't have the strategies that focused on enclosing and owning the IP. And then as we went into the 2000s, owning and controlling the data. The feeling was give it away and the branch plants will carry us along. So as the rest of the world kept getting smarter and smarter in these strategies in Western Europe, in the United States, and Southeast Asia, Canada stayed stuck in an old kind of thinking, and the price of that became greater and greater and greater. Point number one. The second part is as the knowledge and the data economy got more and more powerful and bigger, these companies really got deeper and deeper into the policymaking realm of their countries and the geoeconomic structure, that these became state public-private elements. And that just wasn't in Canada's playbook. Canada's playbook was hands off, free market, cut taxes, cut regulation. Foreign branch plants are as good as a Canadian company. A job's a job's a job, and none of that was true. So it was a product of outdated thinking that never upgraded, coupled with a corporate capture of the policy making, and the price of that just kept growing more and more.
So let's talk about both of those then, because I think those are really key pillars of the arguments you've been making in this space. So the transition from industrial to a innovation or knowledge-based economy. So walk us through, when did that happen, and when did the world catch on to that transition?
Well, America was very deliberate in what they did. They put extensive intellectual property provisions in the NAFTA agreement of 1994. And then they'd spent 5 years developing what are called the TRIPS provisions of the WTO, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. And so that birthed the globalization of the global knowledge economy based on IP.
So what did TRIPS do? Just pause on that for a
Well,
second.
TRIPS set a whole bunch of rules for the world that you have to respect intangible property or negative rights, that the court system had to enforce the fact that somebody had to stop doing something that somebody else claimed they own, like a patent or copyright or trademark or any designs and
So that's
processing.
what you mean by an intangible.
That's an
what's
intangible.
included under the bucket of intangibles?
Yeah, an intangible is what's called a negative right, because it's a positive right is this jacket. I physically own it. It's not rivalrous. Only one person can wear it at a time, and its ownership's not really contested.
It's a nice
much.
jacket.
Oh, thank you very much. I like yours too. But the design of this jacket is a negative right, and that means I can stop somebody from designing that. But it's non-rivalrous, which means 1 million people can use that design at the same time.
Unless you have ownership over it.
That's right.
And rights to it.
But if I have rights to it, I can give permission to 1 million people for that, and I can collect a rent.
So I pay
for
you a
that.
rent to produce your
Exactly.
jacket, and then we both have it.
And when you're
Yeah.
good at that, then a small number of people can get $5 a jacket for a design. You're very quickly $5 million of revenue, say, a year, and that's what drives up GDP per capita.
So you're talking about textiles there, or clothes, but what did the US in particular, who seemed to be driving this new regime, what did they see happening in the digital economy that demanded that transition to a new kind of protections?
Well, it was beyond the digital. It was in every economy. There was IP in every economy. The digital was coming along, but this applied to life sciences. It applied to industrial machinery.
So they weren't just thinking the internet when they did this. They were thinking
It
their
was
entire...
everything.
Okay.
And they said, if you can get good at this, you can capture these rents and get rich, and digital and non-digital. And the Western Europeans were very good at this too. They thought the Dutch had a tremendous, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Northern Italy has got tremendous ownership of these things, very prosperous. And so this was a way to get rich. And so that's how the world was percolating at that time. And those that were good at it were getting richer and richer and richer. Now you take the Asian tigers, And they're in this system, so they became manufacturing hubs, and they were starting to create jobs, whether it's Taiwan or China or other parts of South Korea. And these were not very, Hong Kong, these were not very prosperous places at the time. They were emerging. And then as they were doing this, they found that tremendous amounts of the margin was going to the owners of these intellectual property. So they started to create very collective systems to create pools of IP.
And they did it in the spaces in which they had expertise in the of producing things.
Right,
So
right, where they had
to
potential.
lock in the right.
Yeah,
So,
they
so if you were good at making TVs, you would lock in or build a system to protect
or
IP
textiles
and
or
so it didn't matter the sector really.
every sector, broad parts of the sector. And so they kept building this increasing part of the value chain where they would own it. And this is a very sophisticated and endemic part of capitalism.
Which countries were particularly good at that? So other than the US, obviously.
Oh, well, the Japanese, Taiwan, Singapore, South Koreans have been majestic. All Western European, of course. The British were weaker, but the Scandies and the others, and Israel, and Israel was a poor kind of agrarian country 50 years ago, and Canada was comparatively very rich. And what happens is when you're good at this, you eventually start capturing more and more margin, and then before you know it, you're Singapore, an island state with a sovereign wealth fund somewhere around $1 trillion. They don't say it, but it's big. And you get South Koreans with their tremendous prosperity, and Taiwan, of course, and Japan, and on the list goes. And so that was that systemic emergence, and it really became a world of haves and have-nots in this kind of
in this particular part of the economy.
Well, it's horizontal, so it's
cutting through
the whole economy.
Okay.
So it became a have and have not world. Whether this knowledge base was kind of digital software or whether it was linked to traditional economies, manufacturing, mining, energy, agriculture, on the list goes.
Anything that uses produces a product or uses a technology.
Well, there's no sector that isn't a tech sector. It didn't start that way, but progressively over time, different sectors became more and more knowledge and data driven, to the point where, can you think of a sector that isn't knowledge or data driven? Even when you think about it, it wasn't long ago somebody told me the Calgary Herald made $1 million profit a week. And the big tech didn't invent journalism, but what it did is it used tech and platforms and legal structures to monopolize the intermediation to grab the profit pool from advertising, never having to write a story. So that game works in many forms of legalistic negative rights and innovation.
We could definitely go down that rabbit hole.
Well, they're predation structures of value chains, because production supply chains in the production economy, they're relatively stable. You need somebody to give you that windshield. You need somebody to supply you that gas cap, that windshield wiper. But a value chain is somebody's at the table that you want to get out, because they're unstable. They're structurally unstable. So you're always trying to get the other one out of it and monopolize the whole value chain. Whereas supply chains have a natural physical delivery that is stable in its fragmentation, so that they work under entirely different mechanisms, and you have to have a policy framework and an executive leadership class that understands that if you want to do well in this kind of world.
Okay, so this new structure emerges for the global economy. What do we do?
We did nothing. Canada thought it was the smartest ones in the world, because just cut taxes, cut regulations, get out of the way, and let efficiency take you there. When in fact, these are about structural inefficiency. It's about introducing friction to capture a rent, and you got strategic behavior by nation states. And we didn't think there was any place for that whatsoever. And these other nations were doubling down in their like the US has an IP caucus, it has an IP office in the White House. All other nations were doing these kinds of things to both how do they bubble up their opportunities, and how do they nourish and protect them, and then how do they project them onto the world. Canada had absolutely nothing of that. It had no capacity, it had no understanding that it needed capacity, and that elite policy failure over the last 30 years is why we systemically eroded while these other countries were just soaring in their prosperity.
So what kind of economic activity through that period were we incentivizing instead? Like, it's not like we weren't doing industrial policy, or what is the framework through which we were thinking about the economy?
Well, it was a very dangerous approach because we used a production economy model where in the 70s, and even when you go back to 50s, where Canada was industrialized through branch plants, when you open up a branch plant, they have to bring machinery with them. They bring management skills with them, and the production function created local supply chains. It created a tax base based on the proportion of the labor that was the way
So
that
you
worked.
wanted the factory and the people,
Right.
and that's what was creating,
And you got
and the
a
jobs. That
lot
was
of-
creating the productivity.
And you also get wealth effects, and you get expertise, and you get a lot of those things. But we kept up with that plan, and that was very good when there were few manufacturers in the world. Uh, and so we were competing with now the Rust Belt of the United States, principally, and a wee bit in Western Europe. So we did well on that, and we would have, slightly lower wages.
You create
We would-
incentives for them to come.
Yeah,
you-
and you have, investments in infrastructure to move the goods. You had subsidized healthcare, and it was a pretty good deal comparative to, Cleveland or Germany to do these things. But what happened with these trade agreements, that it globalized the labor market, and so it naturally went to the lowest cost jurisdiction
for
and so-
manufacturing.
for production.
Okay.
So what that did is that put tremendous downward pressure on labor rates. And so now it created a way where Canada had to compete with Malaysia and Guadalajara on labor rates. And so that put more and more downward pressure on labor. Then when you bring in the knowledge-based economy, not long thereafter, you had a second hit to labor, because you could enclose the idea of owning it, of the idea, and that had soaring, increasing returns to scale. So this broke the relationship between labor and capital.
That feels really important. Can you explain that?
Well, I think it was called the Calder effect, or the Calder ratio, that the relationship between labor and capital is relatively constant. But when you globalize labor production to the lowest cost jurisdiction, but you could own the idea and protect it everywhere in the world, not only in your home country.
You've decoupled the value.
You
of
decouple
that,
for
yeah.
the value from the production function. And so if you own the value, you got increasing returns to scale, which means you spit out capital. And those that are really commodified low-end labor got lower and lower and lower dollars per hour, to the point where, what is an automotive worker in Mexico? Are they $3-4 an hour or something like that? And you break that relationship between the capital gets richer and richer and richer, and the labor on the manufacturing gets poorer and poorer.
So I
and
can see
poorer.
that in the manufacturing, the industrial manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
But wasn't the argument in the knowledge economy that actually we had a well-educated population, that well-educated population demanded a market value in the knowledge economy that would receive high salaries, that would then have a spillover effect to our economy, and those people would break off and start their own companies and fuel our own innovation. And right, there was a counter narrative to that, right? That wasn't just driving down costs in the knowledge economy of labor.
Yeah, but absent public policy, that doesn't happen. In a sense, we had that same logic for production function, that you will eventually grow up and have world-class companies if you get the production company. If that was true, then Mexico would have 2 or 3 world-class Mexican car companies right now. And then what happened with this enclosure of the knowledge economy, absent very sophisticated, deliberate public policies to get your fair share of it, the foreign state actors, like other countries and their large companies, they very carefully manage the spillover effects so that they didn't happen in that regard. So they would use things like very aggressive IP, intellectual property provisions that were encoded in trade agreements. They would have very onerous non-disclosure agreements. The ownership was kept at the home country for the wealth effects. The taxes, like Microsoft's Canada's headquarters is in Ireland, so you don't get the tax effect. So they were incredibly sophisticated to ensure that there were no spillover effects. And yet, our public policy approach of our politicians was to bring them here and let them take our best ideas and our best people. And they thought they were tremendous salespersons. Yet, in fact, it's like putting your best jewels of the household on a table on the front yard and say to the neighbors, help yourself. And when they took your diamonds and rubies, you consider yourself a great salesperson, not understanding that they were painting us into an economic corner of no sovereignty and very low value add. And thus you're vulnerable to predation and exploitation in an era of strategic behavior.
By hypothetically a U.S. president.
And here we are. But we painted ourselves into this corner.
So how did this affect RIM? Did this hurt RIM?
No, because my mentors were saying, file IP, get sophisticated. We had 150 lawyers that reported to me. We had about 50,000 patents. We were the fastest growing company in the world for 5 years. People like to have sport that Apple, iPhone, the year Apple launched, we were $3 billion in 2007. We grew to $6 billion that year. We doubled. The next year we grew to 11 billion, the next year to 15 billion, the next year to 20 billion. No, RIM's issue was a strategic issue that in response to the iPhone, Mike wanted to create a clickable display that they called the Storm, and it didn't work. And so what happened is we had 100% returns. Our largest customer, Verizon, said, we're not going to work with you. We're going to work with this Motorola Android. And thus, we now had Apple with the high end and Android commodified. Well, there were about 200 Android phones. They took the price down to $50. So we were in no man's land. And at that time, we made about 1.1 billion profit a quarter on our services business. And so what I wanted to do was decouple it as a proprietary to our devices. We had a plan to launch it with working on Android and iOS. And we had far more subscribers than WhatsApp at the time. And the carriers wanted to do that to make it SMS 2.0. Well, what happened is Mike said to me, if we do this, you'll kill hardware. And I said, hardware's already dead. And then he won a strategy with the board and with the new CEO to cancel that program and focus on hardware, a new operating system, and said, if you wanted our BBM and our rich BBM services, you have to buy our hardware. But that's kind of like saying to somebody, if you want to text with me and call me, we both have to use the same phone. It worked when we were a mini monopoly on smartphones, but it doesn't work when there are 3 players.
So what was stopping other Canadian tech companies at the time from protecting their IP in the way you did and thinking about the economy in the way you did?
Yeah,
it wasn't just government.
So
they
our
also
issue
were
was
doing it, right?
a strategic issue.
Yeah.
But you have to understand at that time, it was a complete hands-off approach. There was no education. My issue with our business schools in Canada is we teach management, not capitalism. And capitalism is a very technical set of enclosure structures. And I'm still prospering after RIM in my office. The investments are astoundingly prosperous because it's a technique of coupling innovation with leveraged enclosure systems. Everybody plays the same game. And yet, for some reason, we don't teach it in our business schools and we don't have it in our policy ecosystem. And I'm deeply involved in our policy community, and I understand the gap in Canada that in the birth of this knowledge economy, we created an innovation strategy at the same time of these in 94. And it's all about efficiency and jobs, which are production structures. And to this day, there's been no change in those understandings and those strategies. Quite the opposite. They keep doubling down on giving away the countries to the point where we had the prime minister, third or fourth day in the job, announce a $6 billion over the horizon radar announcement to foreign companies, BAE and an Australian, when there's a Canadian company that they've been nurturing and supporting that had been qualified to sell to the Canadian and U.S. Department of Defense, and now we don't have control of that strategic technology. We don't get the wealth effects. We don't get the ecosystem spillover, the dynamism, and just imagine that being played over and over again in every form, whether it's battery plants, whether it's biotechnology, whether it's giving away AI. It's been a systemic disease in the economy. And so those that are creating companies, they're dealing with this wind in the face where it's like our coaches are coaching the other team along with their coaches and nobody's coaching our team.
So why? This is when I hear you describe this, it feels a little bit almost like an innovator's dilemma kind of situation where we were so reliant on the resource sector and maybe auto manufacturing in central Canada that we missed the smaller opportunities and allowed others to take advantage of them. Is that partly what happened? Like, was our eye just on we had bulk of the economy and that distracted us? Or like, why?
Well, the elite policy failure over the 30 years is inexplicable because it's all win and no loss. And we had all the ingredients to be successful. We had very smart, very talented innovators. We had promising companies. We had smart researchers. We were coming up with world-breaking ideas. We had lots of resilience in our economy to orient to this stuff. But there was a complete alienation of that understanding in the ecosystem, in the nervous system, in the immune system of those who created those policies. There's a tremendous amount of bullying in how policy discourse goes in this country, and the attitude was we just have to keep giving money to universities, keep more hands off. And the answer was Einstein's definition of insanity. We just have to do a lot more, a lot longer, and it's going to work. And so I think that closed-mindedness and that parochial approach that no other country did is what put us into this situation. The second part is that there was a parallel set of corporate capture in Canada, which is really Canada is more and more about rackets and not markets. And so you strangely have so many people for small dollars that are prepared to sell out the country, sell out the citizenry, sell out the consumer, sell out the worker for small bits of GR jobs.
Explain to me how that works. I mean, let's touch on that for a moment.
Well, I'll give you, let's take it to a very, in Brandeisian competition theory of the late 1800s in the US, they realized that if the companies got too big, this clobbers democracy because they're so powerful they can overrun the politicians. So they very, very carefully checked size. And so as an example in Canada, and I'll just get very tangible rather than abstract, a few years ago, we had the government decide that it would be good for Google to privatize the government of our largest city through Sidewalk Labs. And somehow the decision makers there thought this was a good idea, and then part of the staffers ended up going to work for Google Sidewalk. And what happened is the minister in charge of infrastructure for sidewalk, Minister Champagne, goes into industry. And he's the supporter of this, coupled with tens of billions of dollars going to foreign branch plants for very few manufacturing jobs, where all the control was foreign, all the wealth effects were foreign, and we get a very few number of manufacturing jobs. And local manufacturers were getting their people poached with their own taxpayer money to leave.
How are you defining manufacture there? Because you mean the tech sector as well,
No,
right?
but tech.
yeah.
But this is, you imagine being a small family manufacturer in southwestern Ontario. Your best people are being hired to work for these battery companies with your taxpayer money.
Battery companies that were incentivized to
With
build
their
factories
money.
here. With
And then the
factory
government
money.
says we have to raise your taxes to pay your fair share to subsidize this. This is happening at scale. Whether it's tech or manufacturing, because it's all got there, we played to a low value add, low sovereign control in all aspects of this economy, whether it's Google Sidewalk, whether it's privacy legislation with big tech and domestic oligopolies, whether it's value-added battery technologies. And then what happens is you play that out long enough in a changing economy, you get higher costs because the oligopolies, you get weaker paychecks because you're competing in lower value add, and you get social ailment, mental health, polarization, erosion of democracy. These are all a function of the upstream inattention to the change structure of the economy, coupled with the corporate capture of the political making federally and provincially in this country. And the one who pays the most for it is the citizen. And I've come to the conclusion that this is actually the most important issue of the election. Are you here for the citizen, or are you here for someone else?
So I want to get to what the alternative is in a moment. But when I think of the way at least the digital side of the intangible economy or the knowledge economy has emerged and scaled in the US, there's a ton of, as you say, negative costs to that. You might have higher GDP because you have trillion-dollar companies, but Uber isn't great for Uber drivers. And so, like, how do you take the benefits of that intangible economy, but also make sure that you have low inequality, that you have high living standards, that you have equitable workforces, that you have non-monopolistic behavior of your private sector, right? All the things we know came on the back of that economy.
Well, I mentioned the original sin in Canada, that the revolution happened and we didn't know it. And not only that in the data-driven economy, the self-colonization was at a whole another level that was unimaginable. And what you get in these structures, as I said, you get increasing returns to scale, which means you get richer and richer and richer. And the more data you have,
the companies get richer and richer.
The companies get richer and richer. And the more data you have, you get economies of scale. But then when you have more knowledge than I do, you have information asymmetry. So you can do things like, how Amazon does the pricing of their competitor things, or you do, person-based pricing for capturing the consumer surplus. And when you put all these things together, you get richer and richer and richer. And then what happens is you become so powerful, and these become instruments of public-private wealth.
Which is clearly happening in the U.S. now. We're seeing this
well, it also happened under Obama. It happened under Biden.
For sure. Certainly, yeah.
The state and these companies become one.
Yes.
And of course, the original sin of this structure is it breaks the relationship between labor and capital, which means the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Which is what the U.S. did.
Yeah, they said there's inequality between states.
So I guess what we're getting at is, like, was the risk to just going all in on that model at that moment too?
For the U.S.?
For us.
Well, we didn't even know.
Do we really want an Uber in Canada that?
Well, we didn't even know that the structure of it. And then second of all, look at the announcements this week. Siemens does a research plant in Ontario and it's being celebrated. And it's just, you're going to have people trained on taxpayer money, tax credits based on research here, subsidies from the government, and you get a few okay jobs with all the spillovers going abroad. But when you have, though, you have to understand that if you just think of the job as an atomized element and you don't think of participating with your own healthy firms, a few people get okay jobs, but it's not enough value add effect to raise our GDP per capita. Now, you said in the data-driven economy, it's taken the commodification of labor to a whole nother level, and that's create structural economy. And that is the original sin of the economic structure of the knowledge and data-driven economy. I don't know how you solve that. I think it's going to take tremendous rethinking of this, and I think that's for young scholars. And you brought up the second part of it, that nobody here has ever paid anything or much for these online digital services. So you're paying some other way, and they're appropriating public good for private gain. And do we need to govern for this? Or, I mean, example is, I think the average, obviously there's the mental health of children, which is horrible in this social media, and the total lifetime value of a customer, say on Facebook, is $300. I would say, here, take the $300, don't wreck my kid. So this is a very, very poor bargain for individuals and for society, and that's at play in the ungovernedness. And welcome to here we are, but we are absent a policy expertise to govern the knowledge and data, coupled with an outrageous amount of corporate and regulatory capture. And the one who suffers is the worker, the consumer, and the citizen. And that's where we are.
So is that, maybe that's the other thing then, that not just we, but America even more so than us, got wrong in this economy, was not just to capture the value, but to also regulate the externalities of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the US just let it rip, right? And
That's
they,
probably Obama.
for sure. I mean,
He supersized it all.
without question.
Well, then it's on him.
It's on a sequent, like, I think there's 20 years of a lack of regulatory oversight of this sector.
Well,
in the
once you
US,
push the
and
toboggan
nothing
around the
here.
road and it gets going fast enough, who pushed the toboggan in that direction?
Particularly when you're benefiting from the tool and it all upside and the economy's flourishing
So
and
that's
so on and
the
so forth, right?
co-conspiracy of the political
Precisely.
corruption. Yeah, no, it's and round it goes.
And so
here
how
we
do you
are.
view this tension then? Because I mean, this is often what you hear in this debate, is that, like, look, we should have created an environment that protected and scaled the certain part of the economy in a real way. But you don't often hear that paired with, and we also should have regulated that sector more in a more sophisticated way, like through privacy regulation, which you've argued for, like through ad regulations, like through kids' online protections, like, right? Like, do these things go hand in hand?
Yeah, but the thing is, Canada got all the harms and none of the gain.
So we didn't do either.
No.
Yeah. So it
And
seems to me it's a twin failure.
So we
then,
get to be
right?
poor, expensive, and hurt.
It's a great bargain. This
I
sounds
want
good.
to
Sign me
thank-
up.
I want to thank our political leaders and policy community for failing this generation. And I have to say one thing to those that are more senior in the older voters. I think you have to give a tremendous nod to the younger people and say, we have to leave this campsite better than we found it. We didn't. What do you want us to do? And if I had a younger person that was in this kind of stuff and they said, this is who I want and this is how I want to vote, I have to give a lot of deference to that. I say, I have to follow what you want here, because this is not a time for irresponsibility and selfishness.
I don't disagree with that, but not to get political, but right now it's split. The young vote is a wash right now in the polls this week.
Well,
I don't know
whatever.
which young people should we trust.
Well, the issue is you have to, this has been a long policy failure. This has been an older demographic that has done very, very well, and it's eroded all of the elements. They harvested all the trees they got to sit under growing up, and they didn't plant new trees. So I think you have to start to think about what trees do you plant, not what's in it for me this year. And we're in a very difficult time of transition, but it's of our own making. The attitude of a sentimental and naive view that it's a rules-based international order, when strategic behavior has been going on rampant for decades, and Canada did not think about it, did not adapt to it. Now Trump just took it to a whole nother level.
So let's talk about that level for a moment, because
Sure.
one of the things I admire about you most is your patriotism. I mean, you're the most patriotic Canadian I've had the privilege to meet in
Well, that's
15
one
years.
of the nicest things somebody said to me. Thank you for that, coming
Well,
from
it's
a
true.
thoughtful person like
It's
you.
true. And you care deeply about this country, and you've been successful within it, and you've given, as we've heard, unvarnished critique of it. How do you feel in this moment when you see literally our sovereignty being attacked in a way that, I mean, I've never seen in my lifetime?
Well, I've seen it being attacked. I mean, when you're going to keep giving tens of billions to foreign battery companies, when you're going to allow private companies to privatize government in our largest city.
So you see Trump now and his aggression as just a manifestation, a more explicit manifestation of our relationship with America as it's
Now,
degraded.
Canada's problem is not Trump. Canada's problem is Canada.
So
Pogo, I've seen the enemy is us. And we would be a wonderfully prosperous, proper costed, very good income, very safe country if we just take the boot off our own neck.
and you think that would protect us from a potentially expansionist America? That
Yeah,
wants
because we've
territorial
subverted
expansion?
ourselves so much that if we stop self-subverting through the corporate capture of our political decision-making, what's been a decision in the last 10 years that you can point to that helped the citizen, lowered costs, increased paychecks in this country in a wildly geostrategic, hugely turbulent world? Give me one example federally, provincially, of something that's helped. One of those, there's three forces. Costs are too high, paychecks are too low, and there's social, emotional, political disruption. Tell me one thing that federally or provincially in the last decade that you thought made progress on any one of those forces, and I will give you dozens that set them all back.
Yeah, I don't know about the ratio. I mean, I do think,
Name one.
I think some of our tech policy,
Like what?
like, I'm not going to defend this fully, but C-18. We
Did it
clearly took on
Did it
tech
pass?
companies. Yeah, it did.
What's been its effect?
$100 million from Google a year, predictable funding to journalism for 5 years.
Oh, come on.
It's
And
not It's not
what-
nothing. I don't utterly dismiss that. I mean, I'm critical of the policy for sure too, but like
But
it's
now
something
you
they
create
lobbied
a
heavily
captured
against.
structure. Everyone's given a few crumbs,
Well,
and it's an ex post.
$100 million a year into the journalism sector is not nothing.
What did it used to be, and what's their revenue in Canada, and what's their power in Canada?
I mean, look, I think that's clearly the right question, right? And like, I think there's other ways you could go at some of their capture of the ad market, for example, might have been more effective.
If that's what you're going to hang your hat on, wow.
I,
Giving them all the ability to, and what do you think Google's and Facebook's revenue is a year in Canada?
it's billions.
Tens of billions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No, I know.
so- So the redistribution is some fraction of a percent.
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
And
with
they
you.
still have the control.
I guess my only point is it's something that they didn't want to happen, and
Or was it
pushed it through,
just, and then, Facebook says, I don't care, I don't need you anymore. And Google does the little bits here. And there's all kinds of, who gets it and how is it? Yeah.
yeah. No,
This
I
is-
think because I agree. I mean, we don't disagree here
Besides,
because I think the corporate capture here is huge.
Quebec in a federation, besides in a federation, except for Quebec's privacy legislation, name one thing subnationally done in this past 10 years, given there's tremendous division.
Not a lot.
And all you got is $100 million coming from
Yeah.
Google, who's
No, I know.
gone. How many $1 trillion have they put in their market cap? And we get a crumb.
Yeah. So
That's no way to run a country.
What does the alternative look like there, do you think? So I mean, obviously your argument is across all sectors and
all political parties.
And all political parties, and I hear that. But let's take the tech sector, right? So if we play out how they've taken advantage of the very model you're talking about, right? So Google, Microsoft, Meta all create labs here. They invest in AI labs and they hire some Canadians and we incentivize them to do that, right?
Didn't Google close down their AI lab in Alberta?
Yeah.
After the number 3 AI center in the world.
Yeah.
Of all the patents in Alberta, number 3 there's about 1.5 million, there were 1.5 million granted AI patents a year and a half ago. I'm sure it's much higher now. And number 3 in the world was Edmonton. Do you know how many of those patents are owned in Canada from all their research? 0.
So, and similar things happened when Hinton left the country, right? And
all that went to Google.
Right. So what should we have done instead
Microsoft
in that moment?
Owned the ideas like every other successful.
And how do we, so just spell that out a little bit more for me. So how would we have done, so let's just say Hinton's working in his lab at the University of Toronto. He's working on, I don't know, his machine learning advances. What should the government have done in that moment?
Canada took strategies that no other country in the world did. So for some reason, you can get 30 years of government funding, taxpayer funding, to do research.
Yep, as he did. All of this was funded by public money.
You are allowed to give it away based on a narrow private decision.
Okay, so explain allowed to give it away. What's the mechanism?
Well, you say if I want to, for instance, he can sell it for a few $1 million. The fundamental battery technology in Dalhousie, I believe Tesla gets all the IP and 3M does, and they put $200,000 into the lab. So you get taxpayer funding, but then what you do with the economic spillovers, you can make only for your narrow specific purposes at that time. Nothing to do with the ecosystem dynamism. We just said, let it all go and it'll work out at the end, because as long as you invent the idea, you're going to get the benefits. But the inventing and the ownership commercialization became decoupled structures in this world, and we didn't attune for that.
What do you make of people now who are kind of flirting with more economic integration with the U.S.?
Well, like who?
Kevin O'Leary, someone like that.
Well, Kevin O'Leary is a useful idiot to the Americans. And the fact of the matter is, Canada is not going to have any union with the U.S. There's no mechanism for it. There's no desire for it in the U.S. There's no desire for it in Canada. The issue is will Canada be Puerto Rico without a passport?
So what do you mean by Puerto Rico without a passport?
It means, well, Puerto Rico is poorer than the poorest state in the U.S., but at least you get a passport to come into the U.S. And Ontario right now is below the poorest state in the U.S. It used to be 4 or 5, up there with Michigan and New York. So
based on what measure?
A GDP per capita.
But surely that's not the best. I mean, surely quality of life is better in Ontario than it is in the lowest GDP per capita states in the U.S. by most measures.
I just think that's a very questionable thing to say. If you want to go to Missouri and you can spend $200,000, $250,000 and get a 4-bedroom house and all that, and you look at the erosion,
like health outcomes, life expectancy, inequality, I'm sure all of those are worse in Missouri than they are in Ontario. No.
Well, you look at all of the public safety, and you look at the inequality in Canada, and you look at the quality of the health system, and you look at the cost of living, including accommodations. I think
those are all problems.
If you were given a paycheck of X dollars and you had a choice of living in Toronto or in a chosen place of Mississippi, I'm not thinking they're quite as divergent as they used to be. What's that?
I'd choose Toronto.
It depends on what your paycheck is. What if it's $60,000 a year?
Still probably.
The issue is,
you're right. At some level, it becomes
you look at
more
the
and more
cost
difficult.
Of accommodations and all that kind of stuff. People you have a number of people
which
with,
is why people
with dual incomes in Toronto, and and they're in food banks. Food bank lines have doubled.
I know,
1 in
it's
4 Canadians have
atrocious.
food insecurity.
Yeah.
This is non-trivial consequences, and the whole point of it is this erosion, wherever you fit on a scale. Ontario and Canada is not where it was when I was 30 years ago. It's a marked difference, and it's a function of this inattention. So if we want to flirt with something with the U.S., we're just Mexico is arbitraged blue collar labor. We can be arbitrage white collar labor. Then they get to own the factors of production of whatever interests there are here beyond the white collar labor. Maybe it's some minerals, maybe it's some energy that they get raw and then they value add. And you have to remember, like on energy, we don't refine it. And so if we don't participate in that value add of refining in the ended products, you're always a hewers of wood, drawers of water, and ripper and shipper of other stuff. And that's not enough to lift up our prosperity. Whatever way measure you want to do it, you get that low GDP per capita, you get that weak economic contention for costs of services, and you don't have the money to pay for the different. And the idea that our healthcare and our society and our education aren't going through an erosion.
Oh, why would the last argue that?
Then you're going someplace that isn't good, and that's I said Puerto Rico without a passport. That's the prosperity thing, but you put them all together, and it's not the Canada of the promise that we inherited, and so our job is to leave a campsite better than we found it. I think that's a failed thing. And so you ask why I do it. I mean, I think it's a moral failure to not do your part and not do, if you have resources to bear and you have some capacity, then I think you have to bring them to bear, or it's a moral failing and people are free to do what they want to do. And I've met so many bright young scholars, so many smart people that want to dig in on that. I think we owe it to them to let them design the future they're going to inherit. Let them have the space, let them have the resources, just like we did. And that's the imperative. It's very meaningful. It's very interesting, but the alternative is corrosive.
How would you respond to the U.S. right now? How would you advise that they respond in the
There's
short
kind
term?
of nothing we can do. We are where we are.
So what do you
It's
mean by
kind
that?
of
So how does it
like-
play out then? If there's
Well,
nothing we can do?
it's the idea that this has nothing to do with Trump and everything to do with Canada. That what are we going to do? Nobody's going to invest $1. Like, I have a very active investment office, sizable. I do business every day. Nobody's investing in Canada anymore. They're quietly moving it out. And Carney said it right. He said, whatever we thought is over. And even if he doesn't do the tariffs much, the threat of them is completely shifted anybody's thinking. So they'll still keep doing investments in Mexico and in US, but they won't in Canada. So what's there to do with Trump? People say, I'm going to negotiate a new agreement. Well, the agreement's not worth the paper it's printed on. There's a security override. This is all ad hoc power and leverage. And why do you think the Japanese still grow rice today? Because they know they have to feed themselves if the world gets squirrely. And so all roads for Canada are to create a more sovereign country. And you get this strange chirping from the right that says we can't be North Korea. Let the free markets reign. And I haven't seen a free market in decades, if there ever was one. And so the idea that you help your companies be strong domestically and internationally, it's kind of like tutoring your own kids or coaching your own Olympic athletes. And it's like, no, we need a free market. No, you want to coach your athletes and your people to be competitive into the world, and so that you win the gold medals that you're very proud about. Business is no different. And so how do we start to reconceptualize ourselves in this nature of the world?
So let's make that concrete then, right? So what do we do? I mean, I think people are feeling really vulnerable right now. And like that feeling is real. And like I certainly feel it. And like it does feel like we're under attack. And I'm sure there's many things we've done in the past that are to blame, but I'm also pretty sure that we have a slightly more aggressive manifestation of this now in the
Well,
White
you don't
House.
want an
So what do we
Ontario
do?
premier and industry minister giving 30 million bucks last week to Ferraro, an Italian chocolate factory. I think we can buy some cocoa and sugar and stir it in a machine and put it in a wrapper and sell it for 3 times that cost and do that at
So you're saying
scale.
we should become candy makers. That's our future?
It's symptomatic of that when you have our battery manufacturers leaving here because of the way we disown them. If we make ourselves dependent on one customer for our oil, effectively a monopsony, and then they sell it back to us, and we don't do value
Does
add.
that mean picking sectors that we want to be in? Are we back to sort of that
No, I think
idea?
we just
Or
have to stop the stupid and take the boot off our own neck. And whether it's how we reconceive the advertising market for our own publishers, which I think could be done.
agreed.
Uh,
I think that's a
uh,
huge potential win.
and you look at our media system. Everyone says more money, less money to CBC. Is this really about a full stack content creation, or is this about the public good of the presentation engine and reconfiguring the tens of billions that leave in ads? I think that's the public good in an economic structure, not that their content is 10 times better than the content that we can do here today in a changed production cycle. But there's still a full stack producer in a changed era. I think we're going to have to say, how do we do more? Well, look, the idea of automotive parts crossing the border is over. And so you're going to have to say, how do we participate with non-American production structures? Or we have to say, how do we do more a value-added set of Canadian cars? And they go, yeah, but I won't have 200 models to choose from with 30 different colors. And is that the idea of a good life? And I'm not saying being an autarky, because people, they take the reality and then they'll play a straw man game. Oh, he wants to be autarkic. He wants to be North Korea. No, this is a reality that I've been saying. We need to be more sovereign. We need to be more value add, or we're going to pay a sorry price. And we built a house of sticks. The big bad wolf has come. It's going to be difficult, but we can affect a transition, but we need to understand that transition. And it's not going to work if it's corporate capture. It's not going to work with outdated thinking. And it's certainly not going to work by giving a $6 billion over the horizon radar deal to foreign actors when we need that domestic
And you see this
dynamism.
debate constantly, right? Because then last year they funded that, like the Canadian low orbit satellite company, and that was derided by a lot of people because they should have gone for Starlink instead. But do you
Yeah,
feel
but
like that's
$6
the
billion
right?
in the Trump era, that I can't compute
Yeah,
to
so
BAE.
that
That's
seems
that's
confusing to me too.
that's that's the worst decision I've seen since Sidewalk Labs. At a time we're in crisis, where we actually have to put that money to work for sovereign value add, sovereign dynamism, sovereign control, IP owned here. What do you think these foreign companies are going to go here? You own the IP, you can get rich on this, you can take this around the world. No, they're trying to grow their companies. But that plays out endemically in our policy thing. And the only person that would make a decision like that, or Sidewalk Labs, or the battery plants, is someone who's captured by foreign corporate interests, or someone that doesn't understand how the global economy works. And I say this bipartisan, and I say it's longstanding. And then when we go to the digital realms that you and I talk about, these things have tremendous adverse spillovers. So that when the school boards in Ontario want to litigate against social media for harms, like many of the subnational states have done in the US, we get a premier criticizing them for what are you doing distracting with something like this, even though it's a
When the teachers are
contingency-based law.
literally on the front lines of this thing
And
and
it's a
seeing it.
contingency-based litigation. Who would think that that's a good idea? Somebody that doesn't understand the harms, or somebody that's captured by corporate interests? I used to think it was outdated thinking, more mainly, but I've realized it's both. And if we don't fix both in parallel, then my comment, if Canadians don't make this the priority in the body politic, my only question is how low can it go?
So you've been talking about economic sovereignty for a lot longer than most people in this country. A lot of it's now the cool thing to talk about is how we're going to
Oh,
create it.
welcome to the club.
So
Come on board.
it sounds like a nice place to be.
It's a big tent.
So
It's a big tent. We need lots of hands. We got lots of oars to pull. We got places to go.
I just want to know, like, what will I hear a lot of rhetoric on all sides that we're going to double down on our industrial economy. We're going to double down on the resource sector and manufacturing and so on and so forth. I don't hear a lot about building new IP protections and pools and creating scaling a Canadian tech sector.
Where do you ever hear about? Where do you hear about having sovereign IP, sovereign AI and LLMs?
Okay, so
the only thing they want to say is, "Hey, I'll give you cheap gas to burn and go put up a shell here." And we take ourselves out of 99% of the economic value, 99% of the sovereign control.
I was at the Paris AI Summit. I was at the Paris AI Summit.
I was invited.
That was the pitch.
I've got better things to do.
It was other countries. Well,
sorry, that wasn't
clearly I don't.
But I know that it's like
I'm okay. I'm okay.
It's
with
like
that.
where are we going for dinner?
The game was who can provide the lowest cost power to the American companies to get them to build data.
That's just lowest cost labor all over again.
So what would be a good sign, or what were a couple things that you would see the next prime minister do that makes you signal that they've understood this shift and are maybe not responding to Trump, because maybe that's not possible, but taking Canada in a direction that will increase our economic sovereignty?
Well, stopping the stupid is giving away our best IP and then giving away control of the sovereign AI.
So what would that look like, though? What's the mechanism through which they would shift that?
Sovereign compute is because the nature.
So investing in sovereign compute?
You have to. If you look at, if people know the U.S. Patriot Act, the U.S. Cloud Act, a U.S.-based cloud company in Canada must give the U.S. government access to the data if they request it, and they cannot tell us that they've asked for that. Now, people would say the President of the United States would never do that. So if you don't have sovereign compute, then you're beholden to somebody else taking it anytime, any way they want. Do we double down on what we've done, or do we say that was a mistake and it's a changed world? What does a reimagined Canada look like? And so I think you have to own your IP. You have to truly own your AI top to bottom, including the IP for AI. You have to start to focus on domestic firms with high value added and sovereign control. We've got $4 trillion of, big pension funds money here. We have smart people. We have a lot of resources. We can do a tremendous amount more. Can we be our own best friend again in a bit of a reimagined time? I actually think it's a time for reimagination.
That's what I'm trying to get at, I guess, because I really think that we're in this moment where probably it's hard to imagine another time in the last 30 years that was where there was more opportunity for the vision you're describing.
30 years since World War II. I'm sorry, 80 years.
Sure. So we're in a singularly unique moment.
Yes.
And I want to know what I should be looking for, what people listening to this should be looking for signals from the next government that they're learning the lessons that you're saying we should learn from what happened over the last 30 years.
Yeah, I have to say to everybody, you have no idea how captured the political decision-making process is in this country. We will not get out of it without tremendous transparency.
So how do we break that then?
Well, the problem is the actors in the political system have taken over the process of serving forward candidates who then take their narrow rent-seeking benefits for that, and the body politic suffers.
How do we break that?
I think we have to have a national conversation on that. And I've laid out, I can give many, many more examples, but each of these are horror stories for the Canadians, and yet they just sail right on through. And so I think we need tremendous civic engagement in terms of lobby registries, transparency. I think whoever wins, if they take this transparency of decision making to a whole new level, then we can actually get decisions that benefit the citizen and the consumer and the worker, because we haven't had those. And the thing we have to learn about colonization is very important. For somebody to be colonized, they need local enablers. So Trump can only do his job with local enablers. So we can stop this by stopping the local enablers. And we parallel that with updated capacity. And if we do it, I think it's going to be a far, far better future than the last 10 years have been. And we will have Trump to thank for waking us up.
Thanks, Jim. As always, it's a
great to be with
pleasure
you.
to talk to you and learn from you.
Loved it. Good to see you.
Thank you.